The fog was thick that morning, crawling low through the cobbled streets of the Yorkshire town. It was the kind of fog that clung to your skin and whispered that something wasn't right. And in the middle of it stood a woman, barefoot, wrapped in a faded shawl and tied. Yes, tied by a coarse rope around her waist. Her name was Mary Thompson. She wasn't a criminal. She hadn't stolen, hadn't run. No, she was something else entirely. She was for sale. Mary had married young. That was the way of things. She was 17, with soft hands and quiet hopes. When she stood before the church altar and promised herself to George Thompson, a coal miner with black-streaked fingers and a weary soul. He was older, quieter, not cruel, not yet. But poverty has a way of cracking even the gentlest of men. The early years were hard but bearable. They had a child within the first year, a boy, Thomas, who didn't cry much and always clung to Mary's skirts. George worked long hours down in the mines. He'd come home coughing, body sore, clothes soaked in coal dust. He never spoke much, just ate, drank, and slept. But over time, the silence turned bitter as the wages weren't enough. The debts piled up. George began drinking. At first, it was just on weekends. Then every night. The money that used to buy bread began to disappear into the pub's till. And with the drink came the shouting. Mary learned to flinch at slamming doors. Learned to cook with whatever scraps were left. Learned to protect Thomas when George came home and threw his anger at the walls, and sometimes at her. Still, she stayed. Where would she go? There were no laws that protected women. No family with money. No one who would take in a woman and her child without judgment. She endured until one evening, George stumbled into their tiny kitchen and slammed a jug on the table. "I'm done," he said, breath sour. "You'll be sold come morning." She stared at him. "What did you say?" He didn't even meet her eyes. Just lit a pipe and muttered, "Market day. I'll take you to town. Tie you up and sell you proper." At first, she laughed. It had to be a joke. Cruel? Yes, but unreal. People didn't sell wives. Not really. That was something from stories, from the past, from madness. But he wasn't joking. That night, Mary sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the dark, holding Thomas to her chest. His breathing was soft and rhythmic. Her own heart, though, beat with a noise she didn't recognize. Not fear. Not entirely. Something else. Escape? Was this what freedom looked like? Being tied up and handed to another man like livestock. The next morning, the rope came out. George tied it tight around her waist, muttering that this was how it's done. That this is how everyone did it. That there'd be buyers, maybe even a good one, if she kept quiet. She walked beside him. Not behind. Not in front. Just beside, like an animal being led to auction. They passed neighbors. A few watched with flat eyes. A few looked away. One woman crossed herself. But no one stopped them. No one ever did. When they reached the marketplace, the bells had just begun to ring. The stalls were filled with onions, boots, and woolen shawls. But everyone turned when George climbed up onto a wooden crate and shouted, "Why for sale? Sound a body. Cooks well. Not much trouble. 3 shillings to start." A ripple of laughter. A few gasps. And a crowd began to gather. Mary stood silently. The rope hung loosely from her waist now, like a thread between worlds. Her past, her future. Her heart pounded, but her face was still. Pride had no place here. Only endurance. One man stepped forward, a farmer with wide shoulders and kind eyes. Another, a butcher, snorted and waved a coin. Someone whistled. A child asked his mother what was happening. The mother hurried him away. George shouted again, 3 shillings. Come on, she's healthy. She'll clean your boots and mind your house." Mary lowered her gaze, her hands clasped in front of her. She thought of Thomas, of his small face, his little hands, and her throat tightened. He was with her sister for the day. He wouldn't see this. He must never know. The crowd leaned in, voices rising, coins clinking. Can Mary? She stood still, in the center of history and humiliation. A woman not free to choose her fate, but still not entirely broken star. The bidding didn't last long. There was no real competition. Most came to stare, not to buy. But after a few half-hearted jokes and nods, a tall man with straw-colored hair and dirt-stained boots stepped forward. 3 shillings, he said, firmly. The crowd hushed. A few chuckled. But the man didn't laugh. His face was calm, quiet. He looked at Mary, not with hunger, not with scorn. just a strange softness. His name was Thomas Baker, a widower, a man who kept to himself, ran a small farm outside the village with more animals than people. George didn't wait for a better offer. He took the coins with a smirk and handed the rope over like a leash. "Yours now," he said. "She eats little and doesn't argue." Thomas didn't take the rope. Instead, he looked at Mary and asked, "You walk with me?" She looked at the rope, then at the man, then at the faces around her, some sneering, some silent, some oddly curious. Mary nodded. She untied the rope herself and walked. They said nothing for the first hour. The air was cool. Her shoes were thin, but she didn't complain. Her legs moved on memory. Her mind, numb, distant, drifted to Thomas, to George, to Thomas again. When they reached his small cottage, he opened the door and stood aside. No commands, no claims, just space. Water's in the corner. There's bread on the table. "Rest, if you want," he said simply, and left her alone. Mary sat. The bread was stale but real. The chair was hard but not cold. The silence in this cottage was different from the silence in her last home. It wasn't heavy with anger. It didn't smell of ale. It didn't sting. She slept that night with her clothes on, curled in a blanket, unsure if she was a guest or a prisoner. But no locks turned. No doors slammed. And in the morning, Thomas was gone, out in the field, tending to the animals. Days passed. She cooked. Out of habit, not instruction. She cleaned. She mended a torn curtain. She fed the chickens. Slowly, like a mist lifting, her mind began to settle. Thomas spoke little, but kindly. He thanked her when meals were warm, nodded when she offered tea. Once, he brought her a red apple from town. "I don't need much," he said. "Only someone to talk to once in a while." Mary didn't answer. Not yet. She didn't know if she was grateful or afraid. The village, however, did not forget. People whispered. Children pointed. Women turned their heads. "She's the rope wife," they'd murmur. Bought like a sheep. At church, the pew beside her stayed empty. One woman refused to shake her hand during communion. A boy tossed a stone near her boots and laughed. Mary walked with her chin slightly higher than before. Because what else could she do? One afternoon, while folding laundry outside, she heard two women talking by the fence. She let herself be sold. One spat, like some trollop in the market. "She wanted out, didn't she?" the other replied. "Better a sale than a grave." Mary said nothing. But that night, she stared at the ceiling for hours, her hands clenched into fists under the covers. She wasn't ashamed of wanting to live. She was ashamed that she had to beg the world for permission. Thomas never touched her, never asked, for more than her presence. He once told her, while feeding the goats, "I buried my wife 5 years ago. She died in pain. You look like someone who knew what pain meant, but still stood up straight." Mary didn't know what to say, so she said, "Thank you, not for the compliment, but for seeing her." Winter came early that year. Frost kissed the windows. Firewood was scarce, but the cottage was warm enough. She wore wool socks Thomas found in a market stall, drank tea, wrote in the corners of old newspaper scraps, poems, memories, prayers. One night, as snow fell softly outside, Thomas asked, "Do you miss him?" Mary looked into the fire. "I miss who he was before he stopped being kind," she said. And they said no more. One Sunday, while walking home from church alone, Mary found a crumpled note under a stone on the cottage doorstep. It was from her sister. A single sentence. "George is dead." Mary sat down on the steps, the cold seeping into her skirt, the paper trembling in her hands. He was dead. The man who married her. The man who sold her. The man she once prayed for and feared in equal measure was gone. She wasn't his wife anymore. She wasn't anyone's property. She was unclaimed, unowned, unanchored. As the sky darkened and snow began to fall once more, Mary stood and walked inside. She put the note in the fire and watched it burn to ash. The morning after George's death, Mary didn't cry. Not because she felt nothing, but because she had no tears left to give to a man who had long ago stopped being hers. That day, the air outside felt different. The wind, for once, did not carry shame on its back. She could walk to the market without feeling invisible chains around her wrists. She could breathe deep, honest breaths. And yet, inside her, a quiet storm still brewed. Because freedom, she was learning, did not come all at once. It came in pieces. Some sweet, some bitter. Thomas noticed something had changed. He didn't ask what. Instead, he left a worn shawl by the fireplace, folded neatly. A sign of care. A small gesture that said, "You don't owe me anything." She wore it that night, not because it was warm, but because it was the first thing she'd ever received without cost. The days passed slower now. Not heavy, just quieter. Mary found herself rising earlier, collecting eggs, boiling porridge, sweeping the front step. Not because someone told her to, but because motion calmed her mind. Because repetition soothed her scars. And in those slow, rhythmic movements, she began to think of others. She started visiting the neighboring widow, Mrs. Langley, who had no children. Sat with her, helped mend her sheets, took her soup when the cold crept in. She began to smile, not often, but gently. She even began to write again. On scraps of paper, tucked into the pages of an old Bible, she wrote down thoughts, questions, truths that once had no space to exist. Is a woman still a woman when no man claims her? Does survival count as strength when no one sees it? What does freedom sound like? Is it silence or song? Still, not everyone welcomed her peace. The whispers didn't stop. She's only here because she was bought, they'd say. No proper man would keep a wife like that. Mary would hear them at the well, in the market, outside the chapel. Once, a man spat near her feet and muttered, 3 shillings. That's all you were worth. She didn't flinch. She only looked him in the eye and said, and you were free, and still not worth that much. The silence that followed tasted like victory. One day, she visited the cemetery, not to mourn George, but to stand at the grave of her first son, Thomas, the child who had died in illness during that brutal winter 4 years ago. She hadn't returned here since. She knelt, brushing the snow from the crude wooden cross, fingers trembling. I'm still here, she whispered. I didn't leave. I didn't forget. I just had to survive. Behind her, Thomas Baker stood. Silently. He didn't speak. He just waited, letting her grief rise and fall without interruption. When she stood, she looked at him, not as her owner, not as a savior, but as a witness. A man who saw her and did not look away. That evening, they shared stew by the fire. I've never asked what you want, he said, voice soft. Mary stirred the pot. No one ever has, she replied. He waited. I don't want to belong to anyone, she said slowly. Not even kindly. I want space. To be. Thomas nodded. And that was the end of it. No protest. No promise. Just silence. The kind that felt safe. Weeks passed. The world around them shifted. Papers began reporting on the cruelty of wife selling. Parliament argued. Priests condemned it from pulpits. Cities called it barbaric. The law, at last, began to stir. But in small towns and farms like theirs, the past still lingered like old smoke. Mary began writing letters, anonymous and signed, detailing her story, her truth. She sent them to the vicar, to the parish women's circle, to the editor of a local paper. Some published them. Some ignored them. One woman, a teacher, wrote back, "Your words gave me courage. I am not for sale either." Mary folded that letter and kept it beneath her pillow. Proof that stories, even unnamed, have power. One spring morning, Mary stepped outside and watched the sun rise over the fields. She wasn't thinking of George. She wasn't thinking of shame. She was thinking of how far her feet had walked, of how the rope once tied around her waist no longer left a mark on her skin, but its memory still lit fires in her soul. She had been sold, but she was not owned. She was never owned. In the months that followed, she began to teach young girls how to read. Quiet lessons in the back of the church. She used torn pages, old ledgers, and her own words. And in each girl's eyes, she saw a future that might never know ropes or coins or market bells. A future where women could walk away without needing to be sold first. One evening, as the fire crackled and Thomas poured tea into her favorite cup, he asked, "If you could go back, would you?" Mary looked up, thought for a long while, and said, "I would go back. But this time, I'd walk myself to that market. Not to be sold, but to show the others that you can survive the worst and still belong to no one but yourself." The rope that once held her was gone. But Mary never forgot the feeling. The itch of it. The shame. The silent judgment in every pair of eyes watching her be handed over like livestock. That memory stayed with her, not to wound, but to remind. Because survival, she had learned, wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering with purpose. In 1857, when Mary was in her mid-40s, the British Parliament passed the Matrimonial Causes Act, the first real legal path for a woman to seek divorce. It was limited, expensive, biased, but it was a crack in the wall, and cracks, over time, split open into doorways. Mary read the news in a worn paper delivered by the grocer. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers resting on the ink, thinking of the women who might finally escape without ropes or shame. And then she stood and hung the laundry, as the wind tugged at the sheets like white flags of quiet triumph. Thomas Baker passed away 3 winters later, peacefully, without suffering, just quietly leaving in his sleep. He had never asked Mary to marry him again, never claimed her, never put her in a box labeled wife, or burden, or property. He had simply lived beside her, and for that, she wept, not out of ownership, but for kindness, for silence that felt like shelter. After his death, Mary did not return to her old name. She chose to keep Baker, not for the man, but for the life she had rebuilt with it. She planted wildflowers by his grave, and then she kept living. Years passed. Children grew. Towns modernized. Markets changed. But Mary became something strange in that village. Respected. Feared a little, but respected. Young girls came to her for advice. Some to learn reading. Others to learn how to speak when their fathers silenced them. She listened. She taught. She told them stories, some wrapped in metaphor, others raw with truth. But one story she rarely spoke aloud. The story of the day she was sold. Because that tale was no longer just hers. It belonged to hundreds of women. One autumn afternoon, when Mary was already growing old, she sat with a girl, barely 13, whose father wanted to marry her off to an older man. The girl's eyes were swollen from crying, her voice small. Mary reached out and gently held her hand. And then she said, "You are not something to be given. You are someone to be heard." That was the moment she realized she had never really been a wife. She had always been a woman, and that was more than enough. Mary Thompson was not a queen. She owned no lands, wrote no books, carved no statues. Her name was not in history's golden ink, but in the small, dusty corners of England, among cold stones and quiet kitchens, there lived women like her. Women who were traded like goods, but who rose like truth. The rope that once dragged her through shame became the symbol of her defiance. And though history rarely carved their names in stone, these women carved themselves into the bones of the world, quietly, permanently, because even when sold, even when silenced, a woman who survives, lives. And that is a revolution in itself.